we wanted to include consultancy in the centenary celebration of the Tavistock. Consultancy has played a very important role in the Tavistock activities for many years. 25 years ago, Tavistock Consulting, now shortened TC, was founded as a distinctive service providing consultancy across different sectors, public, private and non-profit. We thought it would be important to have a space to discuss and reflect on the role of consultancy in a time of a crisis. When I say we, I refer to our team that has developed the idea of the two webinars. We all have strong connection with Tavistock Consulting and share the main principle of the Tavistock approach. So the speakers today are Neal, Robyn Vesey and Vega Roberts. Next time we'll also have Gwen Anhara, Ajit Menon and Vega Roberts. So the structure of today, we have got only an hour and 50 minutes and I will try to stick to the timetable, is that after this, my short introduction, Neal will give his presentation, which considered the implication of a psychoanalytic perspective to work during the COVID crisis. And then we'll have 10 minutes for comments, reactions. We invite you not to ask questions, but really to respond to how, how the talk has, what is your response to your connection with what you heard. And then Robyn Vesey will talk for another 50 minutes on, her recent experience of working with leaders that had to respond to the pandemic. And again, we'll have about 10 minutes for comments, reactions. After that, Vega Roberts will offer an overall comments and making some links between the themes that have emerged from Ben's and Robyn's presentation. So the question that will be posed to you will be how the presentations resonate with you. How do you connect with the material? We'll ask you to write on the chat and so that on the public chat, whatever comments you want to make. And of course, within the restriction of the time, I'll try to maybe ask a few people to talk about their reactions. And I might read a few comments if we've got time. So we'll have enough of a dialogue if possible. So now I'm delighted to introduce you my colleague, Neal. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Francesca. So I'm going to offer a sort of fairly loose collection of observations and thoughts related to my consultancy practice during lockdown. It might be a little bit of a gloomy presentation and it's going to ask more questions than it provides answers. And this is partly due to the nature of the work, working with traumatized teams. But I wanted to add that other parts of my practice, such as coaching and supervisions and tutorials, would produce a very different kind of picture, and there'd be lots more positive to take from that, but that's not the emphasis here. So to set the scene, I was going to remind people of The Office, Ricky Gervais's masterpiece, The Office. I was thinking about it this morning and it seemed very relevant to where we're at. The whole series of The Office is a study of narcissism, love, sexual attraction, aggression, and competition. The task of the organisation is never mentioned or discussed. It's as if the life of the work is in the relationships between the people and not what they do. So this seems to me to be the very opposite of the situation we find ourselves working in lockdown, where the life of work is stripped out and replaced simply with the task. So I said I was going to just introduce briefly a little bit of some theory from psychoanalysis, which might help just bring into focus some of the challenges from that perspective. So from Freud, and Freud wrote surprisingly little about work. I'm not sure many of his patients had to work. And I need to acknowledge William Xander here, if I'm pronouncing it quickly, in his brilliant book, The Psychodynamics of Work and Organisations, which really draws together Freud's writing around work. So for Freud, to work in a physically, psychically gratifying manner requires a few things. The capacity to turn the libido outward, away from narcissism, the capacity to desexualize, sublimate, and de-aggressivize the libido and aggression. And for Freud, aggression is the impulse to master. The capacity to create and maintain strong identification with a leader or the leadership, and the capacity to enter and become a member of the group. So as we go through this short list, we can immediately see how working through Zoom on a continuous basis offers significant challenges. So the renunciation of the drives, aggression and libido, well, how do we think about this? I mean, two short examples might be a school who removes the staff room and sees an increase in acting out in the staff team. Because what needs to happen is the staff need a place to regress, to be off stage, as it were, away from their role teaching the children, and to allow an exercise of aggression and libido, perhaps an off-color comment about a student, or putting words to an aggressive wish about someone who's been particularly challenging. Or the bank teller, whilst on stage, always polite, helpful, a smile, but retreats to the back room to say what they really feel, to what they really think. So we see how the sort of flatlands of Zoom strip away these informal spaces, these liminal spaces, where these important psychological functions can take place. And of course, this can be experienced as alienating, dehumanizing. So Freud says the physical work environment places restrictions on the pleasure principle through role structure and informal structures. He also emphasizes the distancing from Oedipal objects and excessive family attachment. And I found this particularly interesting, having to work constantly on Zoom with very difficult clients whilst having two very small children right on the other side of a small door. And we know from what we see in the news that this is a disaster for people, the enforced proximity with family, particularly from people with vulnerable children or children at risk, the risk for domestic violence, which is soaring during lockdown. So this idea of the taking away a necessary distance, which allows people to operate in a healthy way. So this seems to be an important question to me. Who are you locked down with? Is it someone else? Perhaps you're locked down with yourself. Both have their challenges. A client of mine was working in an incredibly stressful environment from her studio apartment. The bed that she slept in was in the same room as the desk which her computer sat on. There was literally no separation between her home life, her home role, if you like, and her work life and her professional role. They were collapsed in on themselves, and the boundary was non-existent. She was exhausted, depressed, anxious, close to collapse. So this is someone locked down with themselves. And the example I gave of my own situation, a 2-year-old child and a 4-year-old child, one doorway away, so the challenge of moving from a work role, consulting to very traumatized teams, experiencing great hardship and difficulty, opening a door and having to switch immediately with no transition to my role as a father. It was incredibly challenging on an ongoing basis. So this is working from home via Zoom. The basic thrust of my thinking today is that working remotely severely restricts, or over time will restrict, the important aspects of adult working life described by Freud. In my practice, I see this most clearly in the stripping out of informal structures and liminal spaces. And whilst these might be replaced by virtual alternatives, additional effort is needed to put these in place and can add to a sense of persecution. It's yet another demand. Whereas ordinarily, in the life of work, these things require no effort whatsoever. They just happen. I've also found that the ability to process traumatic work is limited. My sense is that the processing of traumatic work takes place mostly in informal spaces. Liminal spaces for thinking and processing. The tube journey home, the train, the drive, the coffee shop or the pub. What gets lost when the body is absent? When you can't have a coffee, share a cigarette, gossip, flirt, tell an obscene joke, give someone a pat on the back, or a cheeky wink after a cigarette break. The loss of informal structures and systems, bitching, flirting, exercising authority, is completely absent in the world of Zoom. And I think this leads to a sense of alienation. Also relating to another of Freud's points is the loss of the link with the leadership and the difficulty of identifying with a leader when that leader is busy elsewhere, working from home, unavailable, not physically present, and so on. So I think what we're seeing is the erosion or the collapsing of the boundary between personal and professional roles, collapsed transitional spaces, and a reduction in the time and space to shift and acclimatize as we move between roles. Additional to this, another challenge is that staff are all in different states of mind. People are responding differently, some with denial and omnipotence, some to paranoia and despair. And I see this very starkly in my consultancy work. People that are just, I'm young, I'm not going to get it, it's fine, I want to soldier on, I want to press on. To those in a more vulnerable situation or with people that are living with people who are shielding, very, very worried about going to work. And one of the biggest splits I've seen whilst working on Zoom is working with teams who are crowded around a laptop in the field, as it were, and those who are locked up at home in their personal space. So moving on to some consultancy examples. And I've found in many teams that I work with at the moment that reflective practice or processing groups or incident debriefings, something similar is happening quite frequently, and that's that the staff are simply unable to think. It's as if their reflective capacity has been reduced or impinged upon to the point where they find it almost impossible in some cases to use a session. There's a sense during these sessions that containment, giving a sense of containment, is almost impossible. So this leads me, I suppose, just to a few questions for leaders and consultants. What are the questions leaders now need to be asking themselves when we recognize the demands of this ongoing situation? When we recognize that we're not reaching a finish line, that there isn't a discernible endpoint, how do we shift the task of leadership to accommodate the needs of the staff team and understand what's been lost with working online and the reduction of informal spaces and liminal spaces? How can the workforce now be managed without risking psychological impact of significance on teams and individuals? Very important for all of us, I think, and for teams. How do we look after ourselves in this situation? How do we care for ourselves and keep our heads above water? And finally, how do we draw up our boundaries in this unique situation, both internal and external? What do our boundaries look like in this context? What needs to stay the same and be put back in place? And what needs to be thought about as something new moving forward? So that's my presentation, and those are my questions. I'll hand you back.
Thank you, Ben. Certainly very stimulating. And we've got a few comments on the chat, but I was wondering if anyone wants to write on the chat and let me know that they want to contribute to the to Ben's questions, but also to the main question, which was how this presentation resonates to you and to your own personal circumstances. And we have already a few examples of people who have been, I mean, I can read here Jennifer Spalding talking about I was locked down in China alone in a tiny studio, and then again in London with my partner in a family house with gardens, such different experiences, as it tells. Anyone who wants to signal, I think if you write it on the chat, it's easier for me. I can't see the many of you, so I can't see hands rising. So there is a question here from Kate Tyndall to everyone. How long does the residual trust last? Maybe I will ask Kate to elaborate on this question, if you want.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
The eternal question on Zoom. It's just, I suppose, really resonating with me, the stuff around leading and leading a team, and my team is going back into work and very anxious about it. And because of a health condition, I'm not, and I'm leading them from a distance. And I'm really struck by, you know, how long does that sense of trust in leadership last, especially if your leader's, I suppose, safely tucked up at home is the word that springs to mind. And I'm not expecting people to answer it, but that's very much resonating for me about how do you lead and care for a team at a distance.
Thank you very much. So that's very interesting. So I think we got something from Eloa Barber. So could you say something about your comment on the chat? Hello, Barbara, do you want to, or have I put you on the spot and you prefer to just write? Can't hear anyone. Okay, I can read what she said. Thank you, Ben. Really powerful observation being facilitated across multiple charities the last few months. It has been absolutely relentless. It was really good to hear from you. The specific challenges faced by homelessness charities manifest in other non-profit organizations in various ways. The exhaustion and risk of burnout is colossal. It's really powerful. So we've got also Cindy Valence. Would you like to say something in person rather than on the chat, Cindy?
Hello, thank you. Just thank you, Ben, for sharing that account. It really resonated, although the scale that you're working at in relation to those who are homeless goes beyond certainly anything in my day-to-day lived experience. But I think the image of the continuously moving finish line certainly resonates. And the point that was made as well in relation to the idea of residual trust. I think that question of residual is a really interesting one. And a quote I had heard very recently was about being residual beneficiaries of our own lives in relation to caring for our own well-being and our own mental health. So I suppose it is about trying to find ways to set those boundaries ourselves. And when we're in roles supporting teams, how can we help our colleagues to do that also?
Thank you very much.
Oh, go on.
You want to say something, Ben?
Well, I was just going to say, I think sort of partly in response to the last two comments, I think one of the boundaries that we can normally think about, or is useful to think about, is that the boundary and the difference between the staff and the client system, the staff system and the client system. And there's normally various things there that we can think about. But I think one of the things with COVID is that we're all affected by it. So in some ways, it kind of does something to the boundary between the staff and client system, in that it sort of it levels across both systems in a way which I think is quite difficult. Sorry, Francesca.
Oh, thank you. And I just wanted to go to another comment. Chris Wood, who was commenting on your metaphor, Ben, on the marathon. Do you want to say something more? And who works in NHS? Chris? No. Okay. So Helen, you said something about the presentation resonates with you and what you hear from the client. Do you want to say something more?
Hi. Yes, in the past few months, it was very challenging to support individuals through Zoom sessions because they complain of being exhausted, absolutely wiped out by the changes that take place in the organizations. And since they're working from home, they complain about being wiped out also as individuals and as leaders. So I think it's the anxiety that's there in the organizations, plus perhaps the anxiety about their own skills as a leader or as a manager in this new environment. So I think it goes with what Ben, you shared about this, the marathon line. They ask a question, when is it over? And I wanted to share a personal observation. I found myself not being less strict, but perhaps not holding boundaries as strictly because I have just so much empathy for these individuals. And after the sessions, I'm asking myself, is it me or is it a systemic phenomenon when you just want to hold those individuals and give them more because you see that they cannot hold it anymore and there's no holding environment in the organizations?
Yes, because this is difficult because when everyone is vulnerable, when that's the assumption, when that's the playing field, then being able to challenge robustly becomes very difficult.
Thank you. I think Chris is now there. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought that the metaphor of a marathon runner being told that there was no finish line was very helpful somehow. It just makes me, well, it just helped me think about my anxiety and those of clients, that this will not yet end. And it just helped me think, yes, okay, so that is the situation. So we need to find ways of holding up more boundaries, or thinking about how we create boundaries in this situation. I just found it quite helpful, that metaphor. I'm not sure I've worked it out properly, but I'm sure it's a metaphor that I can continue to think about. So thank you.
Just got a few minutes left. Bianca, do you want to say a bit more in person? What resonates for you?
Yeah, just I think it's more or less the same things is resonating with a lot of people. The fact of the factor of the environment, and together with this kind of internal pressure to be the one, Anthony, helping and actually kind of pushing your boundaries to help others, help clients, help teams, and actually having to deal with that and your own personal stress, and also personal stress of being in a situation in which sometimes confidentiality has to be has to have a rethinking of confidentiality itself. So it was really challenging for me.
Thank you. I'll probably ask someone, I've probably got time for one more. Anthony, could you say a bit more about what you describe in the chat?
Yeah, hello everybody. Well, I suppose it's really, I mean, it's just to state the obvious, so we hold the obvious in mind, which is that there is, of course, an anxiety associated with the pandemic, which plays out irrespective of then its, if you like, sort of obvious cognitive consequences. There is the fear of annihilation and loss and all of that in a very, emotional and irrational way. And then on top of that, there are these specific things that might cause the annihilation, as it were, problems with your job or whatever. And I suppose it just struck me listening to so many people relaying their experiences of everybody being exhausted, and one's read articles about Zoom fatigue, and the neuroscientists and the psychologists tell us that this might be to do with issues around emotional connection and the kind of cognitive labor of working to screens, the relentless attention that's focused on the screen, the inability to pick up lots of nuances or to get away from the people that you're with in the moment. But actually, for most of us, this kind of interaction is only necessary because we're already on shifting sands. We're already in the swamp of COVID, and that's why we're doing it. So I suppose that my question would be, is there learning we can extract from industries that have actually been doing this virtual working for quite long periods of time before COVID came along that might help us pull apart what's really about COVID and what's about the impact of virtual working?
Thank you very much. It's a very relevant question, and maybe we'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. So thank you all for contributing. And now I want to welcome my colleague Robyn Vesey to give her own perspective on consulting in a crisis.
Many thanks, Francesca, and thank you, Ben, and everyone for your comments. And I look forward to continuing the discussion after I share some of my thoughts. I was struck by how, when I was drawing together my ideas and thoughts for this presentation, it was really difficult to think, to make connections between the experiences that I was having at work and the kind of concepts and the ideas that we use in the Tavistock tradition. And I think this is to do with the situation we're in, which we've been talking about, and the challenges of this that Ben's described. And what I also noticed is that at the same time, I found the experience of meeting with other people and working together, even on Zoom, very grounding. It gave me a chance to recover and rediscover some ways to think through being in some kind of connection with others. And so I'm going to share with you some more about this experience and some thoughts on it. I guess I share that kind of observation because I think we all know what it's like to experience that transition, to go from one state of mind feeling disconnected, maybe in denial, maybe feeling anxious or even paranoid, and then to go from that state to another state where you're back in touch with reality and calm, or at least calm enough to think and to act and to respond. And it's this that I've seen in some of my work with clients, which has felt really important. And I would describe it as the process of containment. And I think it's been essential in the work of consulting and working in the Tavistock approach at this time of crisis. So I'm just going to share some experiences in work with two leaders. This is actually a disguised vignette to preserve confidentiality, but these are real things that have happened in my work in recent months. So I'll call these leaders Lucy and Peter. Lucy is the chief executive and Peter is the director of care at a mental health charity, which offers psychotherapy and community support to a community in London. They have funding from different sources, including an NHS contract, to offer services to those living in a disadvantaged area. And they have a strong identity, although it's a relatively new charity. The staff are very engaged in the work and there's a real sense of purpose and of passion. But at the same time, there's a fear of not having quite delivered on the early promise of the work and the aims that they set for themselves. And there's a particular pressure around one of the contracts that's going to be recommissioned in about a year's time. You know, have they really succeeded in this? And of course, this is in the background. When COVID hit, they approached Tavistock Consulting looking for a reflective space for them as leaders in their organisation. And they were particularly concerned about the pressures on them more broadly, but also the pressures that the pandemic had brought. For all of us, the initial lockdown was a crisis and a huge adjustment, and as we've been saying, is in many ways still continuing. And for this charity, it meant that although much of their work was face-to-face, it was not considered essential enough to risk in-person contact. So suddenly everything goes into this online format. Initially, Lucy and Peter were preoccupied with responding to staff and what staff needed, aware that some staff felt very stressed and stretched, whilst others had lost work and had really lost the sense of purpose. Their work was coming to a halt. There were these big questions about how did they now make their contribution. They themselves were working from home and were having to establish all kinds of new ways of working for their staff, setting up meetings, working out how to communicate, how to keep checking in, and this was taking a lot of their time and energy. Lucy and Peter frequently arrived to sessions having just come directly from another Zoom meeting, or on one occasion came to a session when one of them was on leave, so they could meet together. They met each other in other meetings, and they also had time directly speaking to each other, but they didn't really have space to talk through their experiences. Initially, I found myself doubting the value of the sessions. I think maybe identifying with some of the senses of inadequacy or questions about how could this be useful, how could this be successful, when there's so much to do and so much to respond to. But I kind of held on to a belief and a trust that this reflective time would be helpful for them. One thing that I did was I asked them when they arrived what they had both come from, and wanted to offer some of that kind of liminal space really to check in as they arrived and to start to take some time really to start to connect, because it takes time. And I think in this process we could begin to think together. But it was really clear throughout the sessions that there were a lot of intense feelings and a lot of anxieties, and it was really quite painful to think together. And so at times it was very easy for much more of a task focus to creep into the discussion. So I'd often have to bring them back to a more reflective view and help them to stay with some of the difficult emotions. But I think that enabled us to connect with their experiences in their roles and with some of their concerns and anxieties. One key thing that we came to understand was that the collaboration and good work of the organisation were under threat because staff were feeling very concerned that they were failing their clients. They could not meet their clients' needs, and that the organisation as a whole was not meeting the needs of the community. And these concerns were clearly a reality due to the many challenges within the wider system. For example, Lucy was having to manage external stakeholder relationships around exactly this issue, having to have conversations with funders, renegotiate some of the performance indicators in the contracts, because how do you fulfill your contractual obligations when you're in a virtual environment? At the same time, she and Peter were having to manage the anxieties of the staff group and their own experiences of feeling a failure or potential failure. And at times we did get to some of the underlying experiences where there was frustrations and this sense of powerlessness and just the impossibility of providing pandemic safe services that would be able to respond to the needs of a community. And living with that reality and disappointment was the key part, I think, of our conversations and work. It was particularly important to stay connected with emotional experience when dealing with the issues that were dividing the staff teams. One particular example is a split that emerged in the staff group between those who wanted to change the service to better fit the new context and the new needs as they saw it, and then those wanting to honour the work that had been done so far by keeping to those aims, keeping to those practices. And there was a real dilemma for Lucy and Peter. Peter was insisting that staff needed a new vision, but Lucy felt quite overwhelmed by the enormity of reorganising all of their work and having to reorientate things and how to decide how to now use their funds to complete their delivery and to complete their aims. What we came to understand was that the commitment to keeping things how they were, and also the commitment and this wish to change things, were both responses to some of the overwhelming feelings of frustration and powerlessness and inadequacy and criticism. And it was through noticing and discussing this tension that was emerging as both an emotional response, as well as a very real response to the opportunity to reallocate resources. We came to understand that Lucy and Peter needed to work together to both involve staff and also to offer the staff new direction. And we got to a point after a few months where Lucy and Peter had been able to meet with staff, consult with them, and also create a new business plan, which they were just in the process of presenting to their board and then sharing with their staff. In thinking about this work, I've wondered what has been of use, and I've come back again and again to the concept of containment. This relational term coined by Bion to describe the psychological presence of the parent responding to their infant's emotions in such a way that enables the emotional processing and the development of thinking about our experience and our feelings rather than being overtaken by them. In organisational work, we might understand this in terms of our being present to other experiences as a consultant, and in a particular way that allows feelings to be acknowledged and thought about. And of course, this means experiencing them for ourselves as the container, so that we can then bear with them and feed them back in some form, so that there can be that relational experience of something being held and being metabolized. These experiences can be frustration, grief, powerlessness, passion, excitement, confusion. Of course, it's not always easy. But I've seen the way that staying present to these experiences and emotions have enabled people to recover their ability to think and engage with the reality and take up new actions and new connections with each other. I'm so passionate about this idea that I find myself talking sometimes to leaders and groups quite explicitly about the concept of containment. And what I've noticed is something quite curious, which is that at times this idea can be misunderstood. Now, I'm sure this is at least partly due to my own clumsiness, but I think it's also telling us something quite interesting about what happens when we offer containment and about the challenges of offering and indeed receiving containment, especially maybe in particular organisational contexts. And I want to just flag two potential misunderstandings. First of all, people have sometimes responded that containment means something constricting. And I find this really interesting. So this would be an idea maybe of something caring being ultimately controlling. And I think it's a sort of misunderstanding and a distortion of what the consultant is offering, because the idea is that there's something possibly overly demanding, even intrusive and merging that is being offered in this encounter. And it might even evoke a sense of claustrophobia and of constriction. And we can imagine how this idea of containment would get in the way of engaging. People would feel not safe to share their feelings for fear of some kind of intrusion. I think there are also particular systems and system dynamics that might evoke this. So for example, where there is scrutiny and maybe what can feel like quite intrusive monitoring of performance and contracts, then this I think sets a kind of persecutory and intrusive context. With these kinds of experiences, staff might avoid reflective spaces, not finding the time or not finding the budget to allow this kind of contact to happen for fear of what would emerge. The second misunderstanding, I think, is that a containing presence is only supportive and is only there to tend to vulnerability or woundedness. And I think the problem with this idea is that the offer really is something that is out of touch with reality. Ultimately, it's kind of dishonest about what's really going on. I mean, that's not to say that we don't all need engagement and support, and it's a crucial part of some offer of containment and holding. But I think it ignores the reality of boundaries, the importance of challenge, and ultimately an account that is accurate around what is happening. And then what happens then is there's a danger that things are imagined as not quite real. I think this can be linked to an idea that the consultant is fragile or not able to bear things for themselves, or perhaps an idea that the conversation has to avoid conflict or difficult feelings. And again, this limits the sense of safety, the ability to really engage with what might need to be contained, which might include quite aggressive or destructive feelings. Again, thinking about what contexts might contribute to this, I think that systems can evoke this dynamic when there is a kind of an imposed positive spin on communications, maybe internally within the organisation, maybe between staff, and maybe even externally, for example, with funding organisations or commissioners. And I think when there is this sense that we have to avoid talking about the difficult things, staff might engage in effective spaces, but they might collude with this sense that we have to avoid talking about things. They might keep things nice and not really ever acknowledge or work with what's really happening for them. On the other hand, I think staff can be dismissive because they perceive this, reflective space to be somehow out of touch with the reality of their work. So when I think about what I've learned and been in touch with during these months of working with people during this crisis, I think it is that there's an immense amount of value in offering people a containing space where they can be in touch with their experiences alongside each other. And it makes me think about the challenge for us as consultants to do this in a way that is supportive, but is not intruding or demanding of people. And at the same time meets people in the intensity of their experience, including experiences that we find uncomfortable. So it requires of us the capacity to be in touch with our aggressive and destructive feelings in ourselves so that we can allow and encounter them in others. I guess there'd be a few questions that would emerge from these ideas, which is, how do we do the work of meaning making and containment as consultants in this context? What does it require of us, especially when it requires us to be in touch with some of our emotions? And secondly, how do we discern when to meet people in their vulnerability and when to meet people in something that's more uncomfortable and maybe more aggressive? And I guess finally, the question we have already been asking, which is, how do we do this on Zoom in a remote space? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robyn. Very interesting. I'm sure is a lot of people had a lot of connection with what you've been talking about. So I'd like to invite you to write your comments on the chat and really answer the main question, which is, how did Robyn's talk resonate with your experience? And we've got about 10 minutes again, maybe a little bit less. So please do, so I can, let me check. So can I ask maybe Anthony?
Well, actually, what I've written is it'd be really good to hear Ben and Robyn just trading these thoughts about the possibility of providing containment through Zoom, because I thought I heard Ben say it can't be done, or there wasn't any, and I think I'm hearing Robyn saying it can be done, and so it'd be really helpful to understand, you know, what their positions are.
Okay, I think, I don't know, do you feel you want to give it a sort of a short answer now, Ben?
Yeah, I wasn't saying so much that containment's impossible via Zoom. I mean, it's certainly possible to offer containment by Zoom, particularly if you're working one-to-one with a client or a small group. But my sense was it was the containment in the system that was missing, and that's what I was experiencing through the consultancy, which happened to be on Zoom. But I do think some of the conditions of Zoom are very important. So if you've got 2 or 3 people with a very good connection in a quiet place who are committed to participating in the meeting, and so on, then those are much better conditions. But when you've got 3 people phoning in, someone cutting in and out, 3 people in masks around a laptop, 2 other people at home, you know, the sense of containment then is really challenged. So I wasn't saying that it's impossible. It certainly can be there. But I was more sort of commenting on the lack of containment in the system and finding that through Zoom. But I think also, you know, within Zoom itself, there are different ways that you can experience it, or the clients experience it as a containing space or not.
Do you want to say anything, Robyn, add anything briefly?
Yeah, just to say that I think I'm curious about all the factors that impact on how far containment is possible. And I think we are into the nuances of, yeah, like Ben was saying, what are the systemic factors? What are the individual factors that make containment possible? And obviously we know anyway, it can come and go, as it were. But I think I'm curious about what are the things that make the differences for different people. We can discuss some more.
Thank you. Roger Booker, do you want to say a little bit more about what you say in the chat? No. Okay. I'll ask maybe Sarah Wanik.
Stop, I was
yeah, sorry.
I was just thinking the notion of residual was very relevant to containment as well, if there was a prior relationship to the virtual relationship. My experience with one particular head of a psychology service is that there is no sense of a loss of containment in her approach towards the coaching. And I put this down largely to the fact that we do have a long-term established relationship, whereas there are two potential clients who I haven't engaged with, but have professionally in terms of coaching, but who I know vaguely from other professional contacts, who have chosen not to take up a coaching opportunity virtually. And I wonder whether there is a reflection of the containment issue in the decisions they made in relation to going ahead and not going ahead. So that was my thought in relation to containment and the difference between the two perspectives we've just been exploring.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it links with what other people are writing a bit in the comments, what Laura just wrote, you know, and what I wrote before. I think I'm struggling to be challenging, and I think it is about this fear of wounding. And I think that, you know, that does link to containment, because although I think I can make Zoom a containing space, I think it is can be quite a containing space, but how containing really is it if I can't then challenge from that containment? You know, because I think containment and challenge, you know, are sort of connected. They're not, you know, they're not separate things. So then is that by implication meaning that it's not quite as containing as I think, or as I would like it to be, because I can't bring my challenging bits so well? I feel I'm more nurturing. I've got to just look after them a lot. And then I sort of don't like that bit of myself. I had an experience just now of going back to face-to-face with a couple that I've been seeing on Zoom throughout lockdown, and feeling so relieved. I felt like I was me again. And I felt I'd been only a bit me on Zoom. Although I think at the time I thought I was being all me, but the longer it went on for, the longer the marathon just kind of has no end, the more I think I start to feel, I don't think I'm bringing all the bits of me that I would want to bring, and that I would bring normally in the room. And that feels sort of sad.
Sarah, I think one of the challenges, I think, is because, like you say, the container needs to be disturbed. You know, the container needs to have the capacity to be disturbed, you know, along with the contained, I think, you know, and I think that's another one of the challenges, which is different when you're face to face and when you're online.
Thank you. I'm just speaking, I mean, I can't obviously speak, so I don't know if Claire want to say something about people who haven't spoken yet, about your experience.
There we go, I've unmuted myself. Yeah, I suppose it just sort of makes me think about when you're asking about the virtual teams, already working in a virtual teams for the past 4 years. I'm going to use that unprecedented word again. You know, the anxieties that we as a team have experienced have been unprecedented because of the unique situation, and you know, it is about much more, I suppose. It's about the nature of our tasks. Myself as you know, boundaries here, I suppose, as well. I've got dogs barking. But in terms of the task, you know, myself as a nurse, carrying on the work within a virtual team around consultation, training, supervision, that sort of thing. But whilst all of the furore was going off in the rest of the country, makes you think about your role and that sort of thing. And also, you know, very much around sort of the boundaries that we need to renegotiate as well as a team and as a service. And, you know, we're doing that and we've recognised that. But, you know, and the splitting that's occurred of some people going on furlough, some people not going on furlough, and having a very skeletal staff have all created sort of anxieties that I don't think we've had the opportunity to explore yet, you know. So Ben's, you know, presentation really resonated, although it was very much a different service. I interpreted it from my work environment. And just thinking on from Robyn's presentation, you know, what we can learning from children and young people's experiences of online therapy and online services. They tell us that, you know, an online provision is essential. So, you know, what can we learn from that, and how, you know, where does the barrier lie is the question that makes me think about. So yeah, that was that.
Okay, so thank you very much for your contribution. And now I'll introduce to you Vega Roberts, who is going to make some connections about the two talks and also include her own thoughts on the theme. Vega.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. Needless to say, most of what I had in mind to say has been superseded by the conversation in the webinar. So I wanted to go back to when Francesca first had the idea of this webinar, which was before the pandemic really took hold. And it was in the context of the Centenary and a looking at, as the Centenary is a celebration of various contributions that have emerged from the Tavistock, and in this case, around organisational consulting and ideas that first started being put together in the 60s and 70s. The question, what is still relevant now? But a bit like COVID news has pushed, to a large extent, has pushed other news off the agenda, the pandemic has kind of pushed this question a little bit off the agenda. I mean, in a way, we could argue that a lot, if not most, organisational consultancy is in the context of a crisis. Clients often come because they're in a crisis. Only in the usual situation, the crisis is theirs, not ours, not the same one. We might be in a period of crisis ourselves, but it'll be a different one. We're not caught in the same experience, so it's easier to differentiate and to think. And during the pandemic, I think this has got blurred as people have been talking. We're in the same crisis to a significant extent. We're dealing with the same primitive and existential anxieties and with the same or similar challenges, whether it's working with children at home or all the things that have been mentioned. So my question is, what anchors does the Tavistock paradigm potentially provide? And certainly concepts can be very useful, but I think what really stays out of all of this, and will come through the two presentations, is a stance, a kind of fundamental stance or way of taking a role around noticing what is going on in ourselves, working at the perennial question, what is mine and what is not mine, negative capability, so tolerating not having answers to this and other questions without irritable reaching after facts, allowing, even pushing ourselves to be present, to be available, emotionally in touch with the client's experience, and constantly monitoring whether the shifts that we're making in our practice and our thinking are on task or anti-task. So for example, early on in lockdown, the director of Tavistock Consulting decided to be more present rather than less present, and started convening weekly meetings of staff and associates. And early on, we were looking at how people were answering the question from clients, how are you? Because the question had taken on a different kind of meaning, and that at least in those early weeks, clients really needed to know how you were. Are you ill? Are you well? As well as the level of question, are you okay enough to do this work with me and for me? So how do we stay alert to when the meaning of the question changes? Because I think when clients ask the question now, it's not the same as it was in March or April. And it's very easy to slip into the place of thinking that we've worked that one out already without quite realizing how different this experience can be from week to week and certainly from month to month. One of the things that came to my mind as a result of the comments that people were making was something that's quite hard to talk about, is differences in privilege. So some people have found it less tiring to work during the pandemic. They don't have horrendous long commutes to work. They can take a proper lunch break. Even if they're working longer hours, they're not spending those hours in the same stressful ways. We had a contribution on the chat early on, the difference between working in a studio alone in China or in a big house with a partner and a garden. But I think those things are very hard to talk about, but the pull to we're all in this together, and so we're all suffering as much as each other, so to say, I think is quite powerful. And I found myself wondering whether between Lucy and Peter there might have been some of that, because their different roles was exposing them to quite different experiences and different kinds of tensions, and our desire to be an us might take over. And I wondered if what Sarah and others were talking about, the pull to give more than usual, is about sometimes, to a degree, about redressing that inequality and clients absorbing the projections around being not good enough. And so to really be pushed more and more to be as good enough as possible. The other thing that struck me about the Lucy and Peter's story, and then some of the comments that followed, is the pull to the either or. Do we change the aims or do we stay with honor the old ones? And it feels like that kind of either or thinking is powerful, but at the same time, many people are trying really hard to resist it because they want to stay an us, a team that is scattered, that doesn't have the staff room or the water cooler, might find it very risky to look at differences. And the last thing that struck me was the comment, the longer it goes on, that there is something about this marathon without a finish line that really challenges our tendency to think of development as linear. This week I understood this, next week I'll understand a bit more, and so it goes, and it doesn't go like that. Some weeks you've understood something new, and the next week you are again all at sea. And the longer it goes on, the more we have this oscillating between getting a grip on these new ways of working and really having to engage with the challenge all over again.
Thank you, Vega. Again, very interesting. I think what I was thinking of doing is to ask a couple of people from the audience to comment, maybe linking it with what Vega said, and then ask Robyn and Ben to, make their sort of final comments on what they've heard. So I'm seeing here Eloa Babo. Sorry, I might pronounce wrongly your name. And I thought you relate to what Vega was saying. Do you want to say something? Ah, the microphone is not working. Okay. What about John Mason? Your comment, it is a role of privilege to contain that aggression.
Yeah, yes. So I think the question is quite short. I think you may have already said it. Is it a role of privilege to contain that aggression of implicit in that differential? I also made a previous comment, which was looking at this, I guess, the custodial aspect of the parental relationship in terms of that the responsibility of a parent to contain as the custodial aspect of containment.
Thank you. And maybe Richard Sherry, you want to say something about you? I mean, you write along, but just in person, you want to say something about your point?
Hi.
Hi.
It was really interesting, the discussion. I think it, you know, talking about the containment, I think it is a challenge to be able to kind of understand where we're trying to intervene and the models that we're doing that. And also, I think some of it is the depth of the paranoid schizoid anxieties. And I think part of the challenge, particularly in organizations, you're dealing with group effects that are oftentimes shared fantasies, anxieties, other things. So that I think that's one of the things that's a big challenge of how do we understand where in that containment process are we trying to, you know, and whether we are aware of how deep we're going with that. But I think especially with something like COVID, that there are these effects that are there that are stirring up anxieties like death and other things that are shared. And I think it's also what level are we accessing in the ecosystem of that wider environment. It's very interesting to understand where we are in that reparative structure, and also whether we're more lysosomal, killing things off and trying to kind of make things more reparative, and how are we working in that organization and other things as well. Yeah, interesting.
Thank you very much. So I'll ask now Robyn and Ben if you want to make some sort of what you heard and to obviously what you presented. So whoever wants to start.
I can't see Ben at the moment. I can go first if that's helpful, if that's okay. I just had two thoughts really. One was about the dangers of kind of overstating the omnipotence of the Tavistock and the Tavistock approach. You know, I think, as we've been saying, we are impacted ourselves by the situation that we're in, and so there are moments when we fail in our containment and we can't. We have our own feelings that we can't manage. But I'm really curious about what is possible. And at the same time, I'm really curious about the difference it makes not being in our bodies in a space with each other, which is one of these things on Zoom. You know, the Tavistock approach, it uses the image of the body so often, but it's also about a real body that is communicating with another body in ways that we don't quite understand. And we might, you know, use all different kinds of languages to express that. And so, you know, when Sarah was saying, I'm not all there on Zoom, of course, that's the reality. And I think that's a really important thing, that it's hard to even articulate. But I think that we then fall back on relying on the images of each other that we have in our minds, and Zoom becomes the space where we connect via images. And I think there's really interesting, important points about privilege and aggression. And I think the more maybe political side of containment and of this way of thinking. And for me, what I find helpful is to acknowledge the really important emotions around injustice and, for example, racism, for example, inequality, which are there. And then what we do with that is a separate question. You know, I don't want to position myself as part of a privileged group just dampening down and absorbing aggression. I want to think about what is there, but not to ignore it. And for me, this approach and this way of thinking gives a language and gives permission to really name and notice what is happening at emotional levels for individuals and groups.
Thank you. So, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know kind of what to speak to. I mean, I think, you know, privilege is huge in all of this, and, you know, and as usual, it's those with least who suffer most, you know, and these lockdowns and restrictions are disastrous for people with not much, you know, desperate to get their kids back to school so they can, you know, do a bit of work, so they're not, you know, having to access food banks and so on. But I do think, you know, it makes things very, very difficult to understand because of the overlapping, you know, and I wondered, you know, when the sort of eruptions of violence came out during some of the protests, if that something was being displaced, you know, from a kind of rage, you know, emanating from the lockdown and the restrictions and not being able to kind of work through these things in the workplace in a sort of ordinary way. But it's complicated. You know, I had black clients that said, you know, I support the cause, but I'm not going out there to spread COVID, you know, and other people, you know, felt that that was the most important thing that they should do, and it was more important than anything else. So it's very difficult to know what's what. And I think some people, I think Richard, it's very nice to see you after so much time, Richard. You know, it's quite difficult sometimes to figure out, you know, what is an anxiety about COVID and what is an anxiety that's kind of riding on COVID, you know, that was there anyway or has a different source. So I think this perhaps is one of our ongoing consultancy tasks, is really trying to figure out, you know, what's what. You know, what's a real threat and what's a fantasized threat, and, you know, how much risk really is there and how much of it's something else. And so the complexity is there, and you know, and I think it's, as we say, you know, the information is on the boundaries, you know, that old sort of cliche, but I think it's true.
Yes, I think it's a very good point. Vega, do you want to say anything else just that sort of comes to mind in relation to some, just to, before we sort of get into a close, we've got only a couple of minutes left, or something that you were provoked by some of the comments?
I'm just struck by the latest round of comments, how much that demand to be always curious and self-examining is so strong, and, you know, particularly in what the two speakers said, that we can't assume that we, you know, this question, what is riding on what? How are we using the context to give in to other ways of meeting our own needs? You know, all those kinds of questions just seem very powerfully present. And, you know, really, what is COVID and what is other things that ride on the back of it? I thought that was an interesting phrase.
And when we were preparing for this, we were very clear, as you said, I think, Vega, that, you know, we have always worked in crisis, so we had something to offer, and that was different but also similar. So, you know, and you know, how we navigate this, you know, without denying that there is something, you know, very distinctive, but also something that we've known before, you know, and you know, managing that tension, which I feel is very important. Okay, so I think we're sort of reaching to the closure of this, and I want to first of all thank you very much for participating. We didn't know, you know, what was going to happen, so if this would have had an interest, but we had, I think, at some point 180 some people, so clearly there is an interest in this subject. So if you want to come back, there is more for you on the 5th of October. And I think we will talk about, I know a lot of you have more connection with the public sector and the maybe the non-profit, but that will, the focus will be more on the private sector. But I think some of the dynamics are not that different. So we hope that you will find that sort of equally interesting. And also I've been asked to mention that there will be a festival in October of the Tavistock, a part of the celebration. So you will be told the details in due course, but there's something quite exciting expecting us. So thank you all, and thank you the contributors, and goodbye.